Hi there, welcome to video number 5 in the series looking at Joomla 4 for extension developers. Today we're looking at services/provider.php, the file, and it's with reference to upgrading to Joomla 4 from Joomla 3. Now, I should point out at the outset that what I'm going to be covering here is dependent upon these other videos. So if you're coming in here for the first time, I would recommend that you look at these other videos first, because I'll be referring to those a fair wee bit. It's all set up as a playlist. Excuse me. So I'll put the URL of the playlist into the notes of this video in case you do want to look at the other videos first. Okay, let's get started, and we're looking, as I said, at our services provider.php file. So here it is. I've just opened it up. I must admit that whenever I started looking at Joomla 4, I really found this code quite intimidating. I think it's unfortunate that new extension developers are kind of faced with this at the outset. However, if you've gone through these other videos, we're in a good place for understanding this. And I'm going to be using Eclipse a fair wee bit to demonstrate just what happens as we step through this code. So I've got a breakpoint at this line in our Joomla code, and this is where we're capturing the output of the component, and this key line here we're booting the component, which in our case is going to be com hello world. So let's do that. We'll go to hello world, and I'm clicking on this, and I find that we've stopped at this line. Okay, let's just check the variables, and indeed the option up here you can see is com hello world. Right, so let's just step through this with the help of Eclipse. We go into boot component, and after a couple of lines we go into load extension. Okay, so here we are in load extension, and the first thing it does is to check if it's already kind of loaded this extension. I'm conscious that I may have said during the course of some previous videos when we've been talking about this here, remember that boot component gets run from a number of different places in Joomla, that it kind of may instantiate this extension repeatedly and go through our services provider.php repeatedly. It doesn't do that, so apologies if that impression has come across, but if it is previously loaded, then it will actually pick it off this cache here. And if we go through here, we find it hasn't been previously loaded. You would find that if you, instead of clicking on a hello world menu item, if you clicked on one of these things here, it would need to run the router, and because we've got a custom router, it's going to need the custom router to analyze that, and that routing is done before the component is the output of the component is captured. So in that case it would run boot component from the router before this step here. So in actually running this from the hello world menu item, it doesn't need the router to run our custom router. Anyway, let's get going with this. Now this is a key line here. So container get container create child, and the key thing about this services provider.php file is that we have a child container. So here's our main DI container, which is the same as we've looked at before. And now for an extension, the extension gets its own child container, which works pretty much the same way. Whenever we put set, call set on that DI container, we put into it this key value pair. However, whenever we call get on that DI container, it'll get things. If they're in the child container, it will get them out of the DI container, that one. But if it's not in that DI container, that child one, then because this has a link to its parent one, it will try and see if it can get it out of that. So there's a bit of difference there, and the get function will get it out of the main DI container if it's not in the child one. Okay, so let's step over that. And this is just triggering an event which may be picked up by a plugin. Here's our loader file. Path of our loader file. So here is our services provider.php file, and you can see the path over here is going to, whoops, let me move this over a bit. Here's our file, administrator components, hello world services provider.php. And what we're doing here in this line, provider equals requirements path, is that PHP is going to process that file, and hopefully it's going to return something because we're setting the return value to this provider. So let's look at our provider.php file. Here it is, and sure enough, we're returning something. Yeah. We're returning this whole thing here, and this whole thing here is a class instance, right? So this class instance of this class, and this class implements service provider interface, right? So we're returning an instance of some class, an anonymous class, which implements service provider interface. Let's go back to Eclipse. So that's what provider gets set to. And if we click on and look at provider, it's got this anonymous class which is referring back to that services provider.php file. And then it checks if it's an instance of service provider interface, which it is because it implements that. Then it calls the register. So the service provider interface just means that it's got a register function in it. So it's going to call our register function. So it's going to come down into here and start running lines here. So let's check that in Eclipse. We'll step into that. And sure enough, here we are. We're in our service/provider.php file, and we're starting to run down these things here. So let's look at what these items are in specific terms. So the first one is our associations helper. So this is what is required if we have COM associations. And we go down there, and sure enough, here's our container. So our container has now got one resource in it, which is associated with Joomla CMS association extension interface, and it's got an entry in it. So there's our association extension interface, and remember the : class is just gives you a string of this complete fully qualified name, so you can see that's the same as what we get in our DI container. And we've passed an instance, we've passed a new associations helper here. So we've passed a class to it, but we don't get an instance here because the functionality just sets up the factory. So it sets up a function there which just wraps this, a function which basically just returns this value here. So the other thing about this is we've got a parent. So you can see the parent there. And the parent, if we look, is the parent to the DI container, main DI container. So what we've got in here is we've got basically our child DI container, and the parent points to the main DI container. Okay, we'll close that down. So that's our first resource which has gone into our DI container, and then we're going to get that out of the DI container whenever we pick off this here, and we can see this down here. This is where we get that item out of our DI container and set it as the association extension. And I'm not sure whether I put it back here. Association extension. So COM associations is where it shows the items side by side and to enable translation, and it's going to call get associations extension. And so whenever we set this up here, set association extension, remember there's a little difference in the spelling there, then later on COM associations is going to be able to get that be able to call that get association extensions, which is going to return the class which has this, the class instance, which is the functions that it needs to access. Okay, so that's the first one. Let's look at the next one then, going into the DI container, the category factory. So register service provider, as we saw before, what it's going to do is call the register function on this instance, and the category factory, if we look at it here, we can see it's Joomla CMS extension service provider category factory. And here they've got to be aware of this warning I've put in red here, which is that we've got duplicate class names around here. So the category factory, whenever we're talking about it here, is the one in extension service provider. Right. And if we open up that file, here we are, extension service provider category factory, we'll find another category factory, which is the kind of like the true category factory, which creates the categories records. So we've got to be aware that there are duplicate names of classes around here, so you have to look at the use statement to find out which one you're looking at. So let's look at this category factory. Notice first of all that when we look at the file, category factory, our namespace is passed in. So this thing here, this category factory, which is this class here, gets passed in our namespace in its constructor, and it stores that namespace locally. Right. And it then sets category factory interface into our child DI container as the key, and this as the value. So whenever we look at our resources and we step over this, we now have two resources in our child container, and the second one has this category factory interface, which is the same as here. Category factory interface, remember it's the whole fully qualified name here. And it's put in a function, and if we just have a look at that function, this function is going to run whenever we get this out of the DI container. So whenever we later run get out of this category factory, which is down here. We're going to get this category factory interface key out. And we are going to, let's just check this again. Category factory interface. Joomla CMS categories category factory interface. So it's the same key here. We're going to get it out here and we're going to set it against our component. Here's our component getting created. And remember, hello world component refers to our extension, this file here. And so whenever we get this category factory out, we're going to get this category factory out of our child DI container and then set it against our hello world component. So our hello world component will basically have a pointer to our category factory. Let's look at our category factory. So first of all, our namespace is passed in, and on getting it out of the DI container, it creates this category factory, passing in our namespace. So let's look at that file here. It's in categories, category factory. Oops. Okay. So that's what it's going to create, and it's going to pass in our namespace into its constructor in turn. So here's our category factory. Now this is the second sort of category factory, not the same as this service provider one. This is the one in Joomla CMS categories, and we're going to get our namespace passed in. Okay, and it also sets the database from the main DI container. So the second thing it does whenever it gets the category factory interface out is it sets the database, and that is based on getting database interface out of our container. And this is the first instance where it's not going to be in our child container, so it's going to get the database interface out of our main DI container. And if we bothered looking through our parent, we would be able to find our database interface among all these resources in our parent. Okay, so it sets the database, and if we look at our category factory, then category factory. Category factory uses the database aware trait, and that trait is just a bit of code that we kind of can copy in, and it makes available the database here. So it has functions which are basically set database and get database. So inside our category factory, we'll be able to get the database which was previously set in here. So this is the factory set database, and inside this factory we will be able to call get database as well. Okay, so where do we use our category factory? Well, this is used whenever we want to use the categories API. So the categories API, this is just a page in the Joomla documentation, but the category API enables us to go and get category nodes, enables us to kind of analyze the categories associated with our hello world component. And we've got a main categories object, which, if you like, is associated with our partition within the categories table. And we have then below that, we have got category node objects, which are kind of related to the individual records within our categories. And these are held as nested set records. So you can analyze those by first getting our categories object and then going down through and getting category nodes below that. But to get our categories object, if we follow through the code, our category factory is going to call create category. We'll find our category factory and then call create category on it. So if we look at our create category, so this function is going to create the object that we need to be able to get down here and analyze our categories. And if we look at what it's doing, it's calling class name, setting up the class name. It's using our namespace, which again has been passed into the constructor. It's adding on site. So basically this is our site prefix, and then it's adding on service and category, and we don't set that section. So basically it's going to our site service category.php, and this is where we specify that the table that we use is hello world and the extension is com hello world, and that will enable this categories object basically to get the partition in here and relate it to our hello world table, in the sense that this is related to the contact details table for the contact categories here. So that's what's just mentioned there about that service category PHP file. Right, so that's our second item. So as I say, you can get a minimal version of this services provider.php file, and if we look down here, this is here's a minimal version which doesn't have the categories in it. So we only need the categories in it if in our code we're going to be using this categories API, and that, for example, is in our category model, and we also use it within our custom router. So let's just have a quick look at our custom router as well. And here we are, custom router, and here we've got a get categories, and this is getting our categories API, and here we have our this category factory create category. So we're going via the category factory to create the category, and that will be then going into this function here. Okay, so that's category factory. Let's look at the next one, MVC factory service provider. Let's go back to Eclipse. Again, we're passing in our component, our namespace, and in this case, this is within our minimal. We need this if we're going to be basically using our model view controller sort of structure. So let's pop over that, and we see then we've got our third item in our child DI container, which is this one here. Sorry about the line. So we're looking at MVC factory here, and this too is within our extension service provider MVC factory. So if we look at it, again, this is one of these ones with duplicate names, MVC factory. So here's our service provider MVC file. So what's it doing here? It's setting our MVC factory interface. Well, we've already seen that in Eclipse. And this is the function that it's passing in then as the value. Right, so let's look at that. Whenever we do later on in our services provider.php file, whenever we do our get, we're going to get that back out again, and in that case it's going to run this function here, and it's going to set up for us this MVC factory here, Joomla CMS MVC factory. So let's just go to that. And here is the MVC factory which creates our controller. If we go down, we see create controller, create model, and we had a picture of it earlier on. well, we can use this as a picture, MVC factory sitting above our controller, view, model and table. Whenever we get it then out of the DI container, it's going to run its function here, and the first thing I said it does is create this MVC factory, and it's going to pass in again our namespace. So our MVC factory here is going to get constructed with our namespace, and that's pretty key because the classes it's going to create down for our controller will have to include our namespace prefix so that they get the right class names in order for the autoloader to load them. Then what it's going to do is it's going to get further things out of the DI container. It's going to get the form factory interface, for example. Here's another one it's not going to find in our child DI container. It's going to have to go to the parent one to get that. And that form factory is whenever we do load form, for example, in our model, it's going to go to that form factory which gets generated from this, and it's going to create the form instance for us. Set dispatcher, we had a look at that earlier on. It's going to get the dispatcher interface out. Now this dispatcher interface is going to be different, however, from the component dispatcher. So this dispatcher interface is the Joomla event dispatcher. So this is what is used, for example, for triggering events, for example, for plugins or for other things like that. Set database, it's going to get our database interface back out again. It's going to get our router out, and it's going to get these cache controller factory interface out. So it's going to draw out of the DI container these sorts of things. Then if we look at our MVC factory, let's just look at the create controller. At the end of the create controller, once it's created the controller, it has this line, set form factory on object. And if we look and see where that is, here's our set form factory on object, right? And it's going to call that object is going to call set form factory, and it's going to pass down that the form factory. So basically what it's doing here, if we look at it in pictorial terms, these dependencies that it's got from the DI container, remember these things that it's these things here that it's pulled from the DI container, some of these it's actually passing down to the items that it creates. So for example, whenever we get that controller created, it's going to pass down the form factory, which is then going to be available to use within the controller view and model, but not the database. In other instances, it will pass down, for example, the MVC factory. So if we again look at the MVC factory here, whenever we get, for example, a create model, and it's going to create a new class name. So this is where it actually creates the model, and you'll notice that it's passing down this, which is this MVC factory instance. So whenever we get down here, it's going to pass down this inside the constructor. So in this way, things like the MVC factory, which is passed down to the controller, and the model, things like that get passed down, so the dependencies get pulled out of the DI container, either here or here, and then a number of them get passed down to the instances that it creates of the controller view, model and table. Okay, let's just check if we've covered all of these things. Yeah. So yes, as I mentioned, this line here in our code, in our services provider, we need to have this MVC factory here and MVC factory here in our basic one, because this is used for all of the model view controller type objects. Okay, let's go to our next one, component dispatcher factory. Here again, it's in the extension service provider, component dispatcher factory. So let's have a look at it. Okay, so once again, it's getting passed in our namespace, and it's going to be storing that locally. Right. And it puts then into our DI container, it puts something with component dispatcher factory interface, which is this string here and this function here. So whenever we step over it in Eclipse, we will get our component dispatcher factory interface there. You can see that over there. Okay, our next one into our child DI container. Then when it comes out, what's it going to do? Well, it's going to create our CMS dispatcher component dispatcher factory. So this is going to be dispatcher component dispatcher factory. And it's going to pass into that two things. It's going to pass in the namespace that this was constructed with, and it's also going to pass in the MVC factory interface. So it's going to get the MVC factory out of the child DI container. So this is in our child DI container, and then pass that into the component dispatcher factory. And this is where we looked at a while ago. Let's just go back to that component dispatcher factory, because this is got create dispatcher, and this is what is going to create our dispatcher if we have a custom dispatcher, or component dispatcher if we don't, as is in our case. And this is where our dispatch file is, or a dispatch method. So if I may have put it down here. Here we are here. So this is what gets created, our component dispatcher factory. This is the one with create dispatcher in it. And it gets the MVC factory, and then whenever it creates the component dispatcher, it creates the class name, and here it's creating that component dispatcher, and it's putting in MVC factory. So it's passing down into our dispatcher class the MVC factory that was originally got from our child DI container, and it's pushing that down. And so in our dispatcher factory, our dispatcher class instance, we've got a reference up to this MVC factory, and that's necessary because whenever we have our controller, get controller, we want to create that controller, and to create that controller we need to call the function create controller in our MVC factory. Remember, this is the code which replaces our hello world.php there. It's now within the dispatch code of the component dispatcher. So it needs to know our namespace to create the dispatcher, and then it needs to pass in the MVC factory so that we can call that create controller. And this is basically one of the ones that we really need in all of our components in order to get our component actually booted and run. And I think we've covered all of that. Okay, let's go back to Eclipse. What's our next one? Router factory. So this is in extension service provider router factory. So we'll go back here, bring on our router factory. Once again, we've got what it's going to be putting into the DI container. It's Joomla CMS component router factory interface. So if we pass over that, we should get here CMS component router factory interface, which hopefully should be the same as here. So it's passed that in, and here's the function which is set in as the value, and then we're going to get that out at some later point, this router factory here, whenever we call get router factory interface. Here's the same key, so we're getting this out of our child DI container, and we're going to set the router against our component. So if we look at our router factory here, what's it doing? Well, it's getting our category factory. Okay, so it's finding our category factory interface, which was previously put in. If we go back here, here's our category factory. And it's passing down to our router factory. It's passing down our namespace and our category factory and our database interface. And the reason it's passing our category factory is that the router, whenever it's analyzing the SCF URLs, it needs to take account of our categories. So in order to do that, it needs to go down to access the categories interface, as we saw down here. And whenever it does that, it calls this category factory. So because we've got this router, because we've got this here, we can access that category factory, and by that means create the categories that we need to run this categories API here in order to get category node objects to set up our SCF URLs and that. Okay, so here's our router stuff. It gets the category factory, creates that router factory, passes in our namespace and the category factory and the database. So this is required if we're implementing a custom router. If we don't have a custom router, there's no need to implement this. Let's go back to Eclipse. So the final thing we're doing in our register function here is we're calling set, and that is going to set for us a new entry into here, and it's going to set an interface, an entry with the key being this component interface, and this is going to be the value. So if we run over that, here's our new entry, our final entry in our DI container. And if we then drop back, okay, here we have now the type here. If we look at the type, oops, sorry, type is CMS extension component interface, and that is what we have just put in. So our final one that we've just put in is that CMS extension component interface, and what it's going to do is it's going to get that out of our child container. So if we go into that, here's our get within our container. There's no aliases here, so the key is just going to be the same. and then it's going to look for that within our container, and it's going to set it, it's going to get it by calling get instance within our container resource. So we looked before about the value of the items within the DI container is this type container resource, and if it's callable, we're going to get that callable. It's not shared, and it's going to return, it's going to run that callable and pass in the container. So it's basically going to run this function here and pass in the container. So if we go to Eclipse and then drop into this, here we can see what's happening there. So it's running this function which is associated with this, and the first thing it's going to do is set up our hello world component, which is our extension class, and then it's going to set all these other things which we've defined as dependencies to our extension, and it's going to get those out of the DI container, child DI container, or if they're not in the child DI container, it's going to go to the main DI container, and they're going to set them up against our hello world component. So we can just slip through these here. This setting the MVC factory, the factory, category factory, it's going to set the registry. So we haven't particularly looked at that. But the registry is going to be in this here, HTML registry aware trait. So it's going to get a registry record out of the DI container. It's going to go into the main DI container for that, because we didn't set that up in our child DI container, and it's going to get a registry, and this is something that we're going to look at whenever we're looking at HTML snippets. So I think I have a reference to it there. Okay, next one. Our extension gets our association extension, so it gets what we put in here. So really with this one, we've just put this in and got it out again. So it's debatable what value this is. We could just set the association extension to this here, new associations helper, rather than putting it in and getting it out again. But I've just followed really what other components do. Here's our router factory, and then database, and then it's returning the component. The next thing, if that extension is an instance of bootable extension interface, and we've actually explicitly set that here against our extension. Remember, if you don't set these implicitly, even if you have this method here, if you don't set the extension interface that it supports, it won't call your boot. And it's going to then run into our boot function here. And we'll look at this in a bit more detail whenever we look at the HTML snippets. And then finally, it's going to add our extension to the cache, so that whenever we do boot component again, it'll just bring it from that cache rather than running through all our services provider.php file again. Okay, that's basically it. Let's have a quick summary of what we've looked at. I must admit it's been a bit painful, so if you've survived till now, congratulations. But we've got each extension has got its own child DI container, so these classes are instantiated with its namespace. And we could see that, you know, that's why we need our own child DI container, because we can't have two entries in the main DI container with the same key. So we're going to have a number of components that are kind of instantiated during the course of a Joomla session, responding to an HTTP request. So they can't all have the same key. So this is the what our child DI containers need. We need to have, for example, if we look here, each of our extensions are going to have the same sort of thing, MVC factory, with this MVC factory interface. And the fact of having a child DI container means that each of those can have the same key here. If that weren't the case, we'd need to somehow incorporate the namespace within the key, because we can't have duplicate DI container entries with the same key. Service provider classes for the extensions dependencies are in this folder here. So this is basically what we've been looking at. All of these things here are in this extension service provider one. The ones for the main DI container are in service provider, all these ones here. And these classes define their own dependencies. So we've looked at a number of cases where, for example, our MVC factory, it's defining its own dependencies here within this service provider class. And upon get of the component interfaces, the dependencies are extension dependencies, and their dependencies in turn get pulled from the DI. The dependencies then get pushed into our true factory classes. So we've seen that whenever we've looked at, for example, MVC factory. The MVC factory, this class that gets created, then gets these dependencies set against it based on what comes out of the DI controller or DI container. And these dependencies then often get relayed to classes instantiated by the factories, and that's this here. These dependencies then get pushed down to the various instances that the factories get create. And the reason that we need to know about this is that get instance and many factory functions are deprecated. So instead we have to get instances from the DI container, in particular singleton classes, which we in previous times got from the factory calls, or pass down dependencies. So some of those we can get from factory get application, for example, and we looked at getting jconfig there. And in other instances we should be getting, rather than using get instance, for example, from our for our controller view model, we shouldn't be using get instance there because it's deprecated. We should instead be getting those via our factory classes. We should be going to our MVC factory class and getting it to create the instance that it will then return to us, rather than using the get instance class, because at some point it's going to disappear. As well as that, the whole concept of DI is quite powerful in that it enables us to extend it in quite significant ways and override the Joomla provided classes. For example, if we had our own form class that we wanted to extend the Joomla form class, which handles the processing of our XML forms, we could have our own form factory, and whenever we specified our provider.php file, we could put into the container, we could put our own form factory class. Then when MVC factory got out the form factory using this form factory interface, it could pick up what we put into our own service provider class here, container here, and then whenever it passes that down, what is going to get passed down is our super form, if you like, and in that way we can override the form that is the Joomla supplied form, and we can add things onto it if we require in, for example, our model. So it enables us to override some of the Joomla classes and add on to them by putting them as dependencies into our services provider.php file and then picking them. That's what MVC Factory will pick out. We can also push more dependencies down. Now, in our category model in our down here is outputting various information about our categories, and our category model doesn't have access to the category factory. So whenever we're calling get category access, to get that categories API, we're calling get instance. And you'll find in a lot of Joomla code, you'll find things like categories get instance or other get instance calls, so it's not really all sorted out yet. But we could actually pass that categories factory down, and within this upgrading to Joomla 4-step, there are kind of indications about how you could do that, and they're down here in this section here. So basically you can define your own super MVC factory class. So rather than using the MVC factory that comes provided with Joomla, you can have a super MVC factory class which extends this, but which can provide and which can store the category factory. Now, what you'd also need to do then is you'd need to create your own version of your service provider MVC factory and create like a super MVC factory. And I think I did create that over here, which may well still be in our com hello world administrator extension. Here's our service provider class, and it's really got a lot of the same things as the MVC factory service provider class, but is creating our super MVC factory class, and it's also setting the category factory against it. And then whenever we get down inside our model, remember, has got access to the MVC factory, so it can call back into the MVC factory, and it will be able then to call get categories, which uses, here's inside our model, we'll be able to get MVC factory, which will return this super MVC factory instance, this thing here, and then we will be able to get category from that and get access to the category categories object here, which enables us to analyze the categories. So in that way, we can have our own dependencies kind of added in and pushed then down to our MVC type classes. So we can extend this sort of structure here to get further dependencies pushed down. The disadvantage is that we need to define our own kind of service provider MVC class. So we're duplicating a lot of the stuff that Joomla has got here. There's no way just to extend this thing here. We need to kind of write a new version of it. And one of the things to be aware of is that Joomla is liable to change here. So for example, if you look at this issue here, you'll see that someone is suggesting changing the MVC factory to be able to push things down and get access to services via the DI container again. So it could well be that things change within this area, within Joomla, in the near future. It's probably going to happen because there are so many get instance calls currently within the Joomla code, which really need to get something dealt with them in order to get them deprecated in version 5. Here's another thing here which is suggested actually by the same guy in this document, in this book, online book, which I've mentioned a couple of times. And what he is suggesting really is whenever we have our hello world component boot function called, remember that our let's find our hello world component. Remember, when it's a bootable extension interface, we get this boot called. So after it runs our boot component, it calls boot, and in that boot function it gets past the container. So we could actually store that container locally sometime within our class. So we could store it as a local variable, and we can always get access to our own hello world extension by calling factory get application boot component com hello world, which is basically what we were going through in Eclipse there, and is basically what is used by various bits and pieces to get access to our own component via this boot component function call. But we could just use that as well. We will then end up with our own extension here, and we can then do get container, and in that way we can get back wherever we are to our child DI container and really get any more dependencies that we want to run there. We may not have wanted to run them initially whenever we get the interface out, because there's extra resources used in setting those up. So we might want to just get the container to run something else if there are certain circumstances happening. Okay, so I said Joomla is liable to change here, so if I do notice anything, I will update the slides and I will put something into the notes of the YouTube video. And if you notice anything yourself, please do add a comment. But that's about it from this video. Thanks very much for listening. Bye.